On December 17th, 1986, Richard Kuklinski left his home in Dumont, New Jersey, just after sunrise. He placed a package of sandwiches in the trunk of his car. Inside one of them was what he believed to be pure cyanide. Under the driver's seat was a loaded handgun. The plan for the day was simple. He would meet a man at a service station off the New Jersey Turnpike. The man would eat, the man would die, the money would change hands, and Richard Kuklinski would go home. This was not unusual for him. For more than 2 decades, murder had been folded into his routine, the way other people folded in work meetings or errands. He was not one to rush or improvise. He prepared, planned, and left nothing to chance unless it benefited him. What made this morning different was the fact that the man he planned to kill was not real. The cyanide was not real. And the person sitting across from him already knew everything. By the time Kuklinski turned the ignition that morning, law enforcement had spent years quietly reconstructing a pattern they did not yet fully understand. Bodies that appeared months or years after men vanished, victims who went to meetings carrying cash and never returned, deaths that left almost no forensic trail, and always in the background, the same name surfaced. Richie, Big Richie, Richard Kuklinski. The public did not know his name yet. His neighbors knew him as a family man. His children knew him as a strict but present father. His wife knew him as volatile, controlling, and capable of sudden violence, but not as a wise guy, or worse, a serial killer. In Dumont, he was known as quiet, heavy-set, polite, a man who shoveled his driveway and went to work. That morning, none of that mattered. By the time he arrived at the service station, the authorities would surround him with guns ablazing. But it did not begin there. It did not begin with cyanide. It did not begin with freezers. It did not begin with organized crime. It began decades earlier in a city where violence was not an event, but an atmosphere. Jersey City in the 1930s and 40s was not a place that offered insulation from brutality. It was crowded, poor, loud. Families lived close enough that shouting carried through walls. Children learned early which streets to avoid and which men to fear. Authority was not something you trusted. It was something you survived. Richard Kuklinski was born into that environment in 1935. His home did not provide refuge from the outside world. It mirrored it. His father drank and beat his children and even his wife without warning. When Richard was 5 years old, his older brother died. The official explanation for that death was an accident, but years later, Richard would claim it was a cover-up. He said his father beat the boy to death. But there were no charges or an investigation, so the family moved on as if nothing had happened. One day he decided that he was going to steal some wine because he wanted to get a bit of money. He got home panicking, thinking that the police were going to come for him. However, nothing happened. No one came for him. That was the turning point for Richard. That was when he realized, you know what? It really doesn't matter. If I do anything good, or if I do anything bad, nobody notices. By the time Richard reached adolescence, he had learned a few things that would govern the rest of his life. First, that power belonged to whoever was willing to use force. Second, that silence protected those who used it well. Also, he learned that no matter what he did, no one was coming for him. He was small for his age and was bullied by local children. So to prove a point, he started getting into fights. To prove a bigger point, he killed someone while he was still a teenager. The details are unverified, but the story goes. After years of being beaten and taunted by a local gang leader, he attacked him with a blunt object and did not stop. When it was over, the boy was dead. From there, he drifted into petty crime. He stole, he hustled. He learned how to move through the city without attracting attention. He learned how to read people quickly. He learned who talked and who didn't. By his early 20s, he had built a reputation as someone who could be relied on when things turned ugly. He was large, he was intimidating, and he did not hesitate. He also ran a small business dealing in blank videotapes, porn, and film distribution. That made him useful. That business placed him on a collision course with organized crime. One of the men who noticed Kuklinski was Roy DeMeo, a Gambino family associate who controlled large portions of the pornography trade in New York. DeMeo ran his own crew and was already known within mafia circles as an enforcer who handled problems personally. When Kuklinski's tapes began circulating through the same channels, DeMille saw it not as competition to be eliminated, but as a resource to be tested. Kuklinski was summoned. According to Kuklinski's later statements, DeMille did not ask about loyalty or background. He asked whether Kuklinski was willing to kill. To prove it, Kuklinski was instructed to murder a homeless man in broad daylight. Kuklinski carried out the killing, returned to the car, and said nothing. That act marked the beginning of his use as a contract killer for organized crime figures in New York and New Jersey. He was not inducted, he was not made, he was employed. He would later claim that he worked for all 5 of the Mafia families. From that point forward, Kuklinski operated as an external asset. He handled murders that needed distance from formal Mafia structures. He enforced debts. He eliminated liabilities. He was used precisely because he did not belong to a single family and could be discarded if necessary. This arrangement suited him. He did not attend meetings. He did not seek rank. He did not build a public reputation. He took assignments, completed them, and returned to civilian life. That separation insulated both sides. The crime families gained a killer who left no internal trail, and Kuklinski gained access without obligation. It also allowed him to move freely, traveling between states and countries, while unsolved murders followed his movements without immediately connecting to him. And most importantly, he was discreet. By the time he married and moved to the suburbs, the division between his public life and his real work was already complete. His neighbors saw barbecues and family vacations. They saw a man who went to work and came home on time. They did not see the freezer space he maintained. They did not see the weapons. They did not hear the conversations that ended with people vanishing. They were dealing with a system. By the late 1970s, Richard Kuklinski had refined his role. Essentially, whenever Kuklinski came into town, someone died. One time, he checked into a hotel in Maui. That same day, someone was thrown off a third-floor balcony. Kuklinski left the next day. The men who crossed into his orbit rarely understood that. They believed they were meeting a businessman, a distributor, someone with access. They believed they were entering a transaction. What they did not see was the preparation already underway. One of the first confirmed cases followed a familiar structure. George Malaban was a businessman from Pennsylvania. In January 1980, he traveled to New Jersey carrying tens of thousands of dollars in cash. The money was meant for videotapes, blank tapes, a straightforward deal. He told people where he was going. He told them who he was meeting, a friend. He never returned. Days later, his body was discovered in Jersey City. It had been placed inside a 55-gallon drum. To make it fit, his tendons had been cut. He had been shot multiple times. The drum had been dumped down an embankment where it split open. At the time, the murder was treated as violent but ordinary. There was no clear suspect, no witnesses, no forensic trail leading anywhere useful. 17 months later, the pattern repeated. Louis Masguet left his home in July 1981. He was carrying a large amount of cash. He was traveling to meet someone about videotapes. He told his family he was meeting a man named Richie. Masguet vanished. His vehicle was found abandoned. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of violence. For more than 2 years, there was nothing to investigate. When his body was finally discovered in 1983, it appeared out of time. He was wearing the same clothes. His condition did not match the length of his disappearance. The medical examiner found ice crystal damage inside the tissue. The conclusion was unavoidable. The body had been frozen. By freezing the corpse, Kuklinski had distorted the timeline. He had removed one of the few forensic anchors investigators relied on. So the time of death became guesswork, so the leads delayed. Kuklinski's idea worked until it didn't. As the number of unresolved disappearances grew, Kuklinski's greatest risk stopped coming from outside deals. It came from those closest to him. With no trail leading to him directly, the police started shining their lights on his associates. By the early 1980s, several of Kuklinski's regular associates were being questioned in connection with burglaries, stolen goods, and fraud schemes that fed his income. These were not men who met him once and disappeared. They were part of his daily operations. They knew where he stayed. They knew how money moved. They knew how meetings ended. Gary Smith and Daniel Deppner were two of them. When police attention intensified, Kuklinski moved them into hotels. telling them to lay low. He promised he was going to protect them, but it was Kuklinski taking out loose ends. In December 1982, Gary Smith was found dead in a motel room in North Bergen. His body had been hidden under the bed. When Gary Smith's body was discovered, the cause of death appeared straightforward. He had been strangled. Investigators found ligature marks visible around his neck, and around the room there were no signs of a struggle. But the autopsy revealed something investigators did not expect. Smith's skin showed pronounced pink lividity, which was sign of cyanosis. According to prosecutors, there were only two explanations for that presentation: carbon monoxide exposure or cyanide poisoning. At the time, officers did not know what to make of it. There was no evidence of gas, no mechanical source, and no clear indication that poison had been used. The anomaly was noted, then set aside. Daniel Deppner followed months later. His body was found in a wooded area. His death had an eerie similarity with Gary: ligature marks on the neck and subtle signs of poison. By then, investigators had something new: names. Each victim, whether associate or client, had told someone they were meeting Richie, and each had disappeared during a transaction involving cash. But the system Kuklinski relied on required silence. And silence does not survive pressure indefinitely. As detectives began reopening old files, they realized one thing: the murderer was a professional. They knew how to hide their crimes. Authorities in the early stages of the investigation could not tell the full structure. They did not know how many victims existed. They did not know the extent of Kuklinski's connections. They did not know how he was selecting targets. What they did know was that no one had ever caught him in the act. And that was the problem. Traditional investigative methods failed because Kuklinski did not leave witnesses. He did not confide. He did not repeat methods long enough to establish a signature. He changed locations. He changed weapons. He changed disposal techniques. But by the mid-1980s, investigators could see a pattern emerging. The victims fell into two categories: businessmen who went to meet Kuklinski carrying cash, and associates who knew too much about how he operated. In each case, the outcome was the same: disappearance, discovered dead after a while, and no immediate forensic link to him. Each stalled investigation confirmed that distance and time were working in his favor. And with every successful evasion, Kuklinski became more confident in the system he had built. That confidence would become his mistake. Because while Kuklinski believed he was invisible, law enforcement had shifted strategies. They stopped trying to catch him after the fact. They stopped waiting for evidence to surface. Instead, they decided to enter his world, and one man played that role: Dominic Polifrone. To enter his word, Polifrone could not approach Kuklinski directly. First, he had to earn his stripes. He spent months around the same people Kuklinski used. He listened, he waited, and became a wise guy himself. This mattered. Kuklinski did not trust easily. Even his supposed friend didn't survive his wrath. His wife miscarried twice because Kuklinski had beaten her in rage. What he trusted, though, was utility, because he used people. If someone could provide something difficult to obtain, guns, explosives, poison, that person was worth engaging. Polifrone provided that. Eventually, Kuklinski noticed him. Their first meeting was brief. It was not friendly. Kuklinski studied him, watched his posture, measured his reactions. Then Kuklinski asked a question: could Polifrone get pure cyanide? This was the opening. Cyanide was his preferred method. He spoke about it casually. He described how it could be delivered without detection: in food, in drink, in spray form. He described how fast it worked. He was gleeful telling his stories. Once Polifrone confirmed he could obtain cyanide, Kuklinski began to explain the deaths. Kuklinski explained how he kept a corpse in a freezer for 2.5 years. He told Polifrone he preferred poison, saying, "Why be messy? You do it nice and calm." Thankfully, Polifrone recorded everything. The task force now had what it needed, but they still waited. They needed more than confession. They needed intent. They needed Kuklinski moving forward with another murder. That opportunity came when Kuklinski agreed to a contract. Authorities had created a fictional wealthy buyer with cash, a Jewish cocaine dealer. He agreed immediately. He planned the method. He requested cyanide. He described how the victim would be poisoned. He described how the body would be handled if needed. At no point did he hesitate. The final meeting was scheduled for December 17, 1986. On December 17, 1986, Kuklinski met Polyphron to get the cyanide for the murder, which was to be an attempt on an undercover police officer. After the recorded conversation with Polyphron, Kuklinski went for a walk. He tested Polyphron's purported cyanide on a stray dog, using a hamburger as bait, and could tell it was not poisonous. Suspicious, Kuklinski decided not to go through with the planned murder and went home instead. He was arrested at a roadblock 2 hours later. The man who had avoided detection for decades was taken into custody less than 10 miles from his home. Once he was in custody, investigators did not rush to trial. They already understood what they had: years of surveillance, recorded conversations, a sequence of murders tied together not by method, but by proximity to one man. The strength of the case did not come from a single piece of evidence. It came from accumulation. When the trial began in 1988, the courtroom filled quickly. The press framed Kuklinski as a curiosity, a suburban father accused of being a professional killer. The nickname had already spread: the Iceman. It was simple, memorable, misleading. Inside the courtroom, there was no spectacle. The prosecution did not open with graphic images. They opened with timelines. They laid out when men disappeared, when bodies were found, and where Kuklinski had been at each point. He was the last person to have met all his victims. Then they played the tapes. The recordings were not edited for drama. They did not need to be. Kuklinski's voice carried its own weight: calm, measured, precise. He explained how cyanide worked. He explained why he liked it. He explained how easy it was to make a death look natural if you were careful. He described feeding poison to men he knew and watching them collapse. There was no shift in tone between discussing murder and discussing logistics. He did not lower his voice. He did not raise it. For the families in the room, this mattered more than any photograph. They were not listening to a monster performing remorse. They were listening to a man explaining routine. The tapes established something the prosecution could not prove any other way: intent. Gary Smith's death had once been ambiguous. The poisoning indicators were subtle. Without the recordings, defense attorneys could argue coincidence or alternative explanations. Kuklinski removed that ambiguity himself. He described how he gave him the hamburger, and when Smith wouldn't die, he had to strangle him himself. Daniel Deppner's death had been listed as undetermined. Kuklinski explained that too. Kuklinski had Daniel Deppner move to an apartment in Bergenfield, New Jersey that belonged to Rich Patterson, then fiancé of Kuklinski's daughter, Merrick. Patterson was away at the time, but Kuklinski had the keys to the apartment. Sometime between February and May 1986, Kuklinski poisoned him. Louis Masgay's body had baffled investigators for years. Kuklinski explained how on July 1st, 1981, Louis met Kuklinski at a New Jersey diner to purchase a large quantity of blank video cassettes, for which Masgay had $95,000 in his van. He had frozen Louis and stored him, then decided to dump the body about 15 months later. George Malaban's murder had been treated as a violent robbery. Kuklinski explained the motive plainly. It was the $45,000 he'd brought with him to buy tapes. But Richard was smart. He didn't do it just at random. He would really set them up perfectly, and they'd bring him large sums of money and they would disappear. Paul Hoffman's body had never been recovered. He stated that he lured Hoffman, a pharmacist, who thought he was getting a great deal, into a rented garage and tried to shoot him. But the gun jammed. Instead, he beat Hoffman to death with a tire iron. He said he then stuffed the body into a 55-gallon drum and left it outside a motel in Little Ferry. One day, Kuklinski noticed that the drum had disappeared, but never learned what had happened to it. Hoffman's body was never recovered. With each explanation, the defense lost ground. They attempted to frame Kuklinski as a braggart, a man exaggerating his role to inflate his reputation. But the details undermined that argument. Witnesses followed. Former associates testified about Kuklinski's control, his volatility, the way people around him disappeared when they became liabilities. They described fear as a constant condition, not a reaction to a single incident. Barbara Deppner testified about her husband's last days, about being told he was safe, about trusting Kuklinski's assurances, about learning later that he had been used and discarded. The prosecution did not argue that Kuklinski killed out of compulsion. They argued that he killed because it solved problems. That framing mattered. It stripped away mythology. It replaced it with intention. The jury deliberated briefly. In March 1988, jurors found Kuklinski guilty of murdering Smith and Deppner, but found the deaths were not proven to be by Kuklinski's conduct, so that he would not face the death penalty. He was sentenced to a minimum 60 years in prison. After the trial, Kuklinski pleaded guilty to killing Masgay and Malaban and was sentenced to an additional 2 life sentences to be served consecutively. State prosecutors explained he would spend the rest of his life in prison, even if he successfully appealed his previous convictions. Kuklinski also confessed to killing Hoffman, but prosecutors decided not to go to trial. As they had a weak case, and additional life sentences would not have made any difference to Kuklinski's prison term. In prison, Kuklinski did not retreat into silence. He spoke more to psychiatrists, to interviewers, to filmmakers. He described additional murders. Some contradicted known facts. Some aligned too closely to be dismissed outright. Psychological evaluations labeled him with antisocial personality disorder, severe, chronic. He demonstrated no empathy for victims. He expressed regret only in abstract terms, usually centered on the inconvenience his incarceration caused his family. He did not frame his life as tragic. He framed it as inevitable. In interviews, he spoke about his upbringing without visible emotion, about beatings, about fear, about learning early that violence worked. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not deny responsibility. He spoke as if the outcome had always been fixed. That belief was consistent with everything else. Kuklinski had never believed rules applied to him. He believed in leverage, in preparation, in removing obstacles. Prison was simply the final condition he could not bypass. Kuklinski claimed he had killed far more people than those tied to him in court. The number changed depending on the interview, sometimes dozens, sometimes over 100. Investigators treated these claims cautiously. Some details aligned with known cases, others collapsed under scrutiny. This was important. Kuklinski was capable of lying. He understood the power of attention, but he was also capable of telling the truth when it suited him. The task for law enforcement was not to accept or reject everything he said, but to isolate what could be verified. In at least one case, that verification came years later. In 2001, Richard Kuklinski made another shocking claim. He said that back in 1980, he had killed a New York police officer. The officer was Peter Calabro, a 36-year-old NYPD auto crimes detective. On March 14, 1980, Calabro was ambushed and shot to death in Saddle River, New Jersey. At the time, investigators had no clear suspect. Calabro had a complicated reputation. There were rumors that he had mob ties, and he had previously been investigated for allegedly selling confidential information to members of the Gambino crime family. There was also another dark layer to the case. 3 years earlier, Calabro's wife, Carmela, had drowned under suspicious circumstances. Members of her family believed Calabro was responsible for her death. Because of that, when Calabro was murdered, law enforcement believed it may have been revenge, either carried out directly by his wife's relatives or arranged through criminal contacts. Investigators focused heavily on Carmela's brothers, who were considered key suspects at the time. But no arrests were ever made, and the case went cold. But emboldened by this new confession, prosecutors reopened the case. In 2003, Kuklinski pleaded guilty. He received an additional sentence. It did not change his incarceration status. It mattered because it confirmed something investigators had suspected for years. His involvement extended beyond New Jersey associates and into high-risk targets. Even then, most of what he claimed remained unprovable. What law enforcement could confirm was enough. 5 murders proven, 1 additional officer killed, multiple attempted murders planned, a pattern of luring victims with business deals involving cash, a preference for methods that minimized witnesses and forensic clarity. Kuklinski did not believe in transformation. He believed in outcomes. On October 2005, after spending nearly 18 years behind bars, Richard Kuklinski was seriously ill. Doctors diagnosed him with Kawasaki disease and moved him to a secure wing of St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. Here's where things get complicated. Kuklinski had told doctors that if his heart stopped, he wanted to be revived. But his former wife, Barbara, had already signed a do not resuscitate order. About a week before his death, the hospital contacted her to ask if she wanted to reverse that decision. She refused. On March 5th, 2006, Kuklinski died at the age of 70.